Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. How you all doing this afternoon? All right, good. That's what I like to hear, a little clapping. So it's a pleasure to have you all here. My name is Stuart DeQ. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Center for Business and the Environment and a lecturer at the School of the Environment. And welcome to the 2024 Yale Clean Energy Conference. For those of you who aren't from New Haven or Connecticut, every day looks like this outside. So if you'd like to move here, just expect this for months at a time. It's perfect. Chamber of Commerce may have set this up, or Wheatley from Advanced CT may have kind of organized the weather for us here. This is a real pleasure for us. This is like 2 days that are our favorite on campus for a lot of different reasons. Like first, 600 plus of friends, people that we know, people that we learn from and respect all show up on campus from tons of different communities. Right? And so there's a line out there where everybody's just trying to register and pour in, and they'll all be here shortly. But, from the students that are here on campus, like we received, there's over 100 resumes and counting for any employer to be able to look at and consider of where do you pull talent into your organization in clean energy. To the participants in our online programs, the Financing and Deploying Clean Energy Program and the Clean and Equitable Energy Development Program, welcome to campus if this is your first time at Yale. We are thrilled to have you in those. You're a fantastic part of this community. To the faculty and staff that work on this and engage on it, to all the alumni that come back, to the community partners in Connecticut, in New Haven, in the region, and around the globe that help us work on all of these programs, and to the 40 organizations, both from the largest that work in clean energy to the earliest stage companies that are all a part of this conference, those that are sponsoring, those that are speaking. It really takes a remarkable group of people to put something together like this, and we're deeply appreciative of it. And, I hope that over the course of the couple of days here, you get the time to spend in conversation and engagement to learn and get inspired by some of the people that are around here, because there's an incredible depth and breadth of talent that we see across this community. And after being here 16 years, you get to sort of see some of that develop over time, where you get to see the kind of Green Bank movement flourish and come up and know that there are people who are in classrooms here or teaching or guest lecturing who are putting that in place. You get to see kind of whole new parts of a journalistic landscape for clean energy sprout up and have people from the Yale community or the broader community that we engage with be a part of that. You get to see people go from students in an MBA program or in an undergraduate program or at the School of the Environment or a PhD start out in kind of a class or an independent project and then be leading some of the largest organizations that are out there. You get to see the largest elective class at Yale become Renewable Energy Project Finance between the School of Management and the School of the Environment, where 200 students pack into this and take it every semester in the spring. So the landscape for clean energy has changed dramatically around here. We're thrilled that there's so many smart and incredible people who get to work with us, and really thankful that you all have made the time to spend a day and a half with us here. One of the things that's critical if we're going to be really good in this space is that we have to have people who are the North Star, who provide the compass about where we go. And part of that's Yale's internal commitment and how we see ourselves and where we invest in the institution, in the university. There's a lot that you can do with teaching, with research, but what are you doing with your operations? How are you setting goals and targets for the university to be able to achieve something? And where are you doing it with grace and style and a sense of how do you build a network underneath all these different complex institutions that can rally and galvanize the people that are in this place? And the person that we have doing that is Amber Gerard, who leads the Office of Sustainability at Yale. And, she is someone who you will see behind the scenes in every conversation about where do we get more geothermal installed, to how are we doing better recycling on campus, to where are the goals and targets of the university. In those meetings popping up with a very graceful question and approach and a thoughtful way of bringing more people into the conversation. So we're jazzed that she can kick us off here with kind of comments about where we are, where we're going, and then we'll have an introduction from RWE, our lead sponsor, for our keynote. So Amber, please come on up.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. This is such a treat. I don't know about you all, but I feel like I'm still riding high from the Climate Week wave, a couple of weeks ago, and all the momentum down in New York City. This year it was fantastic. We had a showcase of Yale events as part of our Planetary Solutions Initiative. We had over 30 different events at the Yale Club where we were bringing together our thought leaders and scholars and activists and alumni, all to think about how do we drive new pathways towards impact. It was great to see CBay showcase there, 8 new early stage ventures talking about what they were working on. And we're continuing the momentum. So here on campus, this is Celebrate Sustainability Week, where we're actively engaging with students, with staff, with faculty, to think about what are the important conversations we really need to be having about all those topics you just mentioned, but also thinking about how can we as an institution really try new things, innovate, learn by doing, but also leverage our purchasing power as a major institution. How can we think about leveraging our ability to take risk? When I think about how this journey all started for Yale back in 2005, we were willing to take some risks even then. Yale was one of the first institutions of higher education to set a commitment to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions back in 2005. That was a target that we achieved in 2020, at which point we said, no, we've got to do more, we've got to do better. So we expanded our boundary that we were looking at. We set a target to be net zero by 2035 and have zero actual carbon emissions by 2050. And I will say that is easy just to say, but how do we actually get there is a lot more complicated, especially when I think about the fact that this is a major complex institution, right? Our campus goes back over 300 years. We have 15,000 students that we serve. We've got over 18,000 employees here. Everybody's here on campus living, working, studying, playing, learning. How do we take that without too much disruption and work towards zero emissions? 21 million gross square foot is what we're looking at. It's over 400 buildings. Those are all part of that climate target. And if we look at what is 80% of the bulk of those emissions, it actually comes down to 65 of our buildings. So think, galleries, museums, athletic facilities, some of our residential colleges, but the majority of it actually is our laboratories and our clinical spaces, so the areas where we're doing really high impact, critical research to solve many of the world's challenges. And this is only going to grow exponentially over the next few years. Yale is investing $5 billion of capital investment that's going to be deployed over the next 5 years to really drive our academic priorities and the university's future success. And a lot of this investment is in those physical sciences that have such a high energy footprint. Yet at the same time, we are committed to delivering that growth with that zero actual emissions target in mind. So our approach to doing this is really twofold. We need to focus, double down on conservation through efficiency upgrades and really policy changes on how we do things here on campus, while also leveraging renewable energy, both in terms of what we have on campus and also what we're purchasing. Over the next 30 years, we are going to be investing $1.3 billion in these efforts. So as we look over just the next decade, what that means is all of our new buildings and construction projects will need to be zero carbon ready, which is a new standard that we deployed about a year ago. For all of our existing buildings that we have on campus, those 400 that I mentioned, we're looking at deep energy retrofits, especially in those high impact laboratory and heritage buildings. What we want to do is have our energy use intensity in those buildings and prepare for electrification of our heating systems. But then we have to maintain ongoing efficiency work in order to preserve those savings at the same time. And we've been doing this over the last 8 years through 170 different conservation projects. So it's a huge effort to reduce our emissions while at the same time building up our clean energy capacity. We're deploying solar through various projects and really looking at a variety of funding and project delivery mechanisms, which have been more challenging than I would have expected and have required us to really be agile and nimble in our approach. But as our campus is really quickly expanding, where our focus has been recently is actually below ground. So we are in the process now of starting to dig geothermal boreholes that are being installed across the street. Actually, you may have seen some of the drill rigs over there and across the campus in general. The boreholes will allow for seasonal energy storage so we can balance the heating and the cooling loads throughout the year and basically use the ground as a giant battery. This will tie into a new thermal utility plant, actually several of these across campus, that are going to be equipped with heat recovery heat pumps that will enable us to make low temperature hot water to distribute around campus in lieu of our 100-year-old fossil fuel current steam utilities. So even as we speak right now, we're in the process of drilling across the street to support our new physical sciences and engineering building. So this is going to be a huge complex to support quantum science, engineering, and materials. So what we're doing there is we're actually leveraging both vertical drilling and also inclined drilling at a diagonal. And what this allows us to do is optimize the surface area and minimize the disruption as we're digging just across the street more than 250 boreholes, 850 feet deep. So we're going to replicate this model across campus in other hotspots for development. We're really excited about this. We have an incredible energy management team on campus, a great capital project team that are really driving this work and thinking about how can we try new things, take lessons learned, and then apply them into other projects on campus, but maybe even more importantly, be able to share our lessons learned with the world, which I think is such an important part of being part of an institute of higher learning. We have to be able to test things, try out what doesn't work, and then be able to adapt. And really, we got to be able to practice what we preach. And it's a really important moment to be doing this. As we grow our campuses, I think every day about the decisions that we are making around our critical infrastructure and how vital they are. I mentioned the steam distribution system that we use right now to heat and cool our campus was built a century ago. Our power plants are not going to last forever. And so you think about the systems that we are investing in and building today, these will be with us for the next century, and we're locking in our energy future. So it's really important while we're building at a very fast speed to be able to think very carefully about the decisions that we are making and have that long-term view. Because we know that the future is going to look a lot different than it does today, both in terms of the energy that we need, technology advances and our research advances, but also as we think about the surrounding climate. I know many of us have probably been watching the news really anxiously today to see what the impacts in Florida are going to be from Hurricane Milton. And just last week, we're looking at what's still unfolding in North Carolina and Georgia. And this area is not immune to these kinds of threats. In Connecticut, by mid-century, we are expecting 20 inches of sea level rise, and we're already starting to see more intense rain and wind events, which impact our local energy supply, disrupt our transportation networks, impact business continuity, and they have huge impacts on our campus. Hurricane Ida in 2021 knocked out power and caused flooding in all of our residential colleges. And obviously there's big impacts to the local community as well, where a third of our employees live. Just miles from me here in the Naugatuck Valley, we had a 1,000-year rain event 6 weeks ago. Huge impacts. Researchers from the Yale School of Medicine and Public Health, in partnership with Operation Fuel, which is a nonprofit that does energy assistance for Connecticut residents, and in partnership with the Connecticut Green Bank, identified a need for climate-smart technology in order to be able to provide people with affordable housing units access to home medical device power, because during an outage, that may be a life or death situation for those folks, or enable them to avoid trips to the emergency room where our hospitals are already overcrowded. And we know that as these temperatures are continuing to get hotter, They're worsening New Haven's air quality and bringing increased heat mortality. So I pretty regularly think about what are the impacts on our workforce going to be with this. You know, over the next 5 years, just for the construction workers alone that we're bringing to campus, what are these extreme heat days going to do to them? What about our students who are here on campus staying in the summer in unair-conditioned spaces? Or folks who maybe don't have access to cooling centers at home and are worried about their families. So we have to be constantly thinking about the vulnerability of our campus, that of our broader community, and all of this has to be top of mind as we double down on our mitigation efforts. But we also really have to embrace our role as a neighbor and think about, as we're building, what's the future that we want to see for the community around us? And I am glad to say that our efforts to improve stormwater infrastructure, as we focus on enhancing our green spaces, our shade canopy, and as we advocate for more active transportation systems, we are contributing to our climate goals while also improving biodiversity and making sure that we're looking out for the health and well-being of our community. As a legacy institution, over 300 years old, we make really important decisions that have huge impacts on a daily basis, impacts that will last generations. So it's really imperative that we leverage our intellectual assets here at the university, think about how do we take advantage of our operations to lead by example, how do we train tomorrow's leaders, and convene conversations like the really important ones we're going to be having over the next couple of days. All of this is an example of how we're bringing together all that Yale is and all that Yale does in search of planetary solutions. So let's dive in. There's a great program in store for the next couple of days. It's amazing to have so many researchers, thought partners, experts here, alumni, to really dive into this topic of clean energy and think about how do we seize this opportunity to change the future. I hope you're going to find it enlightening, inspiring, motivating, as you think about what's the role that you as an individual play in building the future that we want to see. So enjoy, have fun, and I look forward to the conversations.
Thanks, Amber. And, we asked Amber to focus on clean energy and the commitments of the university and all the things that they're doing there. But if you really enjoy being out in nature and you're interested in the health benefits of that, the way that it makes you feel, the kind of changes to your emotions, to your creativity, this is also something Amber geeks out on a very consistent basis. So if you're interested in the connection between nature, health, and in well-being, you can also talk to Amber about that. So one of the interesting things about the Yale network that we've heard over time is that people would go to early conferences in wind energy, or they'd go to early conferences on resilience or everything else. And at some point, they'd ask a question just like, hey, did you go to Yale? And there were then all these hands that went up, just at the very early stages of many things. And what we found over time is that there's this kind of unknown, incredibly powerful network of people who've come through here who've been intrinsically motivated to try to figure out the way to solve some of the toughest challenges in clean energy and in the energy system. We're thrilled that those folks are partnering with us as well now in building this conference and doing these things. So I'm going to invite up the folks from RWE who are going to introduce our keynote speakers, Scott and Laura. But Scott's one of those folks who I had the opportunity to work with in building case studies and spending time in my office and figuring things out when he was a student at the School of Management. And it was clear then that this was going to be a lifelong commitment to sort of changing and shaping a system. So it's really been a treat, and we're deeply appreciative of your support for the conference and being able to make this happen. The reason it's accessible and the reason we can make all this content and all this available is because we have the generous support of sponsors. So really, thank you, and please come on up.
Thank you so much. We're so proud to get to sponsor the Yale Clean Energy Conference, and we do it selfishly. There's two people sitting in the front row, one of whom we met at the conference last year, Yale College grad of 2023? 2023, and Hackett, a Yale School of Management grad of 2024. I'm RWE's Vice President of Development, overseeing onshore wind, utility-scale storage, and utility-scale solar. And RWE is probably the largest energy company that you guys have never heard of, and we kind of like it that way. I hope that does change in a handful of years when you guys are coming back for another conference or a reunion and you're taking a plane, and hopefully you see about 2.7 gigawatts of our offshore wind farm off the coast of New York in a couple of years. So RWE is proud to sponsor this. We're very excited about the next segment. We have an operating portfolio of about 10 gigawatts. We are the third largest clean energy company in the United States, and we hope that some of you at this conference come work for us.
Hello everyone, I'm Laura. I lead our hydrogen development group. So that's a new technology that we add to our wind solar assets across the country, building electrolyzers to use our green power to then produce hydrogen and help to decarbonize industries that cannot easily electrify. So we always try to be at the forefront and expand beyond what we do in the power sector as well. But we're not here to talk about us. We're here to introduce our next speakers. Rob Myers, founding executive editor of the Heat Map News. He has previously been a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covered climate change, energy, and technology. He is also an opinion writer at the New York Times. And what I found interesting is that he has made it onto the Vox Future Perfect 50 list for demystifying exactly what the energy transition could look like and building public understanding in a time of crisis. So please come up. Second speaker here comes from the policy world, Ali Zaidi, White House National Climate Advisor to the President. With his law degree, he has previously been at the New York Deputy Secretary for Energy and Environment, and he has held various positions under the Obama administration. So we have media represented here, policy, and we are excited for your views on what the energy industry holds.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Pleasure.
I should add, as you may have seen above, this is also in addition to we're doing double duty with this. So this is both. We're privileged to be the keynote speakers today, but we are also recording our podcast at Heat Map, Shift Key. Here, this is a live recording of Shift Key, and my co-host, Jesse Jenkins, a Princeton University professor of energy systems, sadly could not be here today, but he sends his regards. So anyway, Ali, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
So let's actually just start here. There is seemingly endless climate news coming out of the administration. So much climate news that as I go to summarize it, I struggle to get a grip on it, right? There's the tax credits, there's the EPA regulations, there's environmental regulations that aren't related to climate but are nonetheless very important, like the lead pipe news that came out a few days ago. Just overall, taking stock, and we're going to dive into this, so we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty yet. How's it going as we end year 4 here?
When we started out the administration, the president was very clear. We were in the decisive decade for climate action, and it's not his words, it's the words of the United Nations IPCC. And I think as we take stock, it's really important to recognize we are at halftime in that decisive decade, not all the way through and not all the way done. But the progress we've made has been nothing short of staggering. We've doubled our pace of decarbonization in the United States. And we've done it with a very new formula for climate action, which I'm incredibly excited about, that is aimed at rebooting our manufacturing competitiveness in the United States. We've really sparked a manufacturing renaissance unlike what anyone would have guessed or predicted. And we've done it by really, I think, lifting up the American middle class. Whether it's a focus on union jobs or a focus on environmental justice or a focus on breaking down the economic barriers to participate in the clean energy economy, it's been about bottom-up, middle-out economic development. And I think that's, to me, the wind in our sails as we look to make up even more ground in the climate race at even a faster clip in the second half of the decisive decade.
The Biden administration has created all these new institutions as part of not only the IRA, but the CHIPS Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and it's reformed a lot of new institutions too. So DOE has changed a lot. The IRS has long been a big player in this space, but now it's like a really big player in the space. The state energy offices have changed. Of course, there's the green banks we were just hearing about. What, as you look forward to the second half of this decisive decade, as you put it, what institutions are we missing right now? What do we still need to add to the mix?
One of the places where I think there's profound opportunity is in the area of industrial decarbonization. Steel, cement, aluminum, those heavy industries that we thought for too long were impossible to decarbonize. Now we're taking a real shot at them. But the way these products work, because they cross our borders, because they're so heavily involved in trade, we need to level up our trade institutions. A few weeks ago, New York Climate Week, I was with the head of the WTO, having conversations with folks in other countries, all of whom are, I think, starting to make this a priority for the years ahead. And that's going to require new institutions. It's going to require new economics. It's going to require new measurement schemes. That's a platform that's absolutely essential. One more that I'd throw out there.
And now let's go back to trade, because I think this is important.
Yeah, absolutely. One more that I'm really excited about is the opportunity to build a really robust mechanism to deliver value to indigenous communities and frontline communities who can help us get more carbon benefit out of nature-based solutions. We have been building a voluntary carbon market that works for Wall Street, not for the indigenous communities that have been the shepherds of these resources for generations. We need to flip the script. And we have the data, we have the tools, we have the satellites and the AI. We've got to build the political will to harness that opportunity to the max.
What would that look like?
You know, first of all, I do think it's harnessing some of the new tools we have in the satellite and AI arena. But then it's a question of taking that into conversation with folks in the Amazon, folks in DRC, elsewhere, and trying to build sort of a supply-driven approach to what is possible. Right now, I think the way the market's been moving is, folks look at their CSR budget in New York, and then they put out an ask, and then you get developers in the middle trying to figure it out. We need to put more capacity, and our development agencies have put more capacity in the hands of the communities, so they're actually pushing the supply out, and that's what's shaping the marketplace.
How much do you think about carbon, like these voluntary carbon markets at the White House? Because I think 10 years ago they would have been a big part of what we thought of as climate policy, how offsets worked. It was took a lot of mind share. Today, hopefully, I think they seem to be slightly less important compared to other parts of the decarbonization mix. So I just how are you thinking about fitting this into the broader
we issued a set of principles from the federal government. I signed on, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Agriculture, Energy, others, to help shape up some more integrity into these markets. I'm less focused on the market, and I'm more focused on the sector in terms of an emissions perspective. So how do we get more out of lands? How do we get more out of forest? How do we get more out of nature-based solutions? That's the focus. I think the platform is subservient to the opportunity. Same as trade. I'm not so obsessed with what's the trade mechanism. I'm focused on how do we drive the emissions reductions in heavy industry.
I want to go back to this key idea around manufacturing, which which you've described as like central to the Biden administration's climate goals. Do you think that's set in broadly yet, either with how people think about climate change in the discourse, in the kind of elite discourse, or has it trickled down to voters? Like, is it something that the Harris campaign might be seeing out in the field? I think it's obviously such a central idea to how the Biden administration has characterized and thought about the challenge. And I guess my question is, do you see it actually getting out there today? What are people missing about it?
First of all, I think we're at an inflection in most of these industries around manufacturing, and it could still break a bunch of different ways. So the way we actually succeed at this mission is by sticking to it. In terms of how it's playing out on the ground, I think it's idiosyncratic. It's depending on the industry, depending on the region, and there's a question about cause and effect. Do folks see all of the policy architecture that's standing up these industries, or do they maybe think in what I think is incomplete and inaccurate, that it's just one tax credit that made this possible? So I think that's an unfinished storytelling endeavor that we're undertaking. But the way we solidify is by just continuing to expand and grow the enterprise.
I guess my question here is, it seems like so much of the central idea of the IRA and of Bidenomics is that voters respond to local investment. That that for too long, Democratic administrations, when talking about climate policy, failed to take into account these working class communities. They failed to invest in these working class communities, and that a program of real investment in manufacturing, in industrial decarbonization, just an industry period, would see them respond. And obviously, voters have not yet voted in the 2024 election yet, and maybe they will surprise us. However, what we have seen so far is that, first of all, I think the program is real, and I want to be clear about that. Like, there's nearly $500 million of investment since the IRA. I'll let you hit that stat later if you want to. But also, the Teamsters haven't endorsed the Harris campaign. The firefighters haven't endorsed the Harris campaign. We, in polling, see non-college white voters continue to trickle away. Now non-college people of color trickling away from Democrats. And so I guess now, 4 years later, what do you feel like we've learned about this central idea? Is the central idea true? Like, will voters respond to the investment that's happening in their communities? Or are we missing something about this mechanism?
So I won't speak to the campaign or to the candidate because I'm here in my official capacity. I do think, though, the politics have shifted. You take a look in the House Republican caucus where they've put 50 votes up to try to repeal parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, and they've failed. And you've got a dozen and a half, not the entire caucus, but a dozen and a half members of the caucus who've sent a letter to their leader saying, hey, let's maybe go home on this one because we're not figuring out how to pull the rug out from underneath all of these manufacturing jobs. So I think that speaks to a political durability that is only there because steel went in the ground at these factories. And, you talked about the unions that have engaged on this transition, and that's actually a pretty essential part of this. The fact that you've got machinists in York, Pennsylvania, who are making hydropower units that are now getting deployed all across the country, that you've got EOS, which is a battery factory in Pittsburgh that's now unionized with the steel workers, the UAW picking up a big chunk of the work on the electrification of the transportation sector. The steel workers went to Convolt and got a neutrality agreement on solar manufacturing. I think that's part of the theory of change. So if the question is, are we all the way there yet in getting everybody bought into this theory of change? No. But by dealing a lot of folks into the upside, I think we're building momentum behind getting there.
Do you think Republicans would repeal the IRA if given the opportunity in the trifecta? Because, of course, they have a lot of opportunity. Like, all the votes they've taken so far don't really matter. The stakes were low. In a trifecta, do you think we'll see Republicans repeal the IRA?
It would be an economically reckless outcome. It would be a gut punch to the American middle class. And it would set us massively behind in a global competition where no one else is slowing down in the race. And I think it would be met with massive resistance, not only from all of the workers who count on this investment being the way they put money in the bank and food on the table, but also a bunch of Republican governors who've been running around the country touting the success of their economic development agenda, which is built on the foundation of the Inflation Reduction Act. You think about places like Oklahoma and Georgia and Indiana. I've sat with many of those governors on stages like this one. They're seeing, like we are seeing in blue states, we are seeing in red states, a manufacturing renaissance. How are you going to go to them and pull the plug on that enterprise? So the bottom line answer is they may try. I don't think they will be successful because I think it is a politically, not just malpractice, it's politically non-viable.
Can I ask, when you talk to workers, the union workers, what do they tell you about fossil fuels? Like, how do they express, because obviously you're making investments here that are decarbonizing industries, and you're going to places that where there has been investment in doing whatever the industrial activity is, or generating electricity in a zero carbon way. But when you hear from workers, like how do they think through kind of the relationship between fossil fuels, or just talk about fossil fuels and the clean energy industrial work that the Biden administration has helped fund?
It really depends on where in the workforce and where in the energy transition folks are. So in places where there's been dislocation, I think there's real unalloyed excitement that there's an opportunity to bring work back. Place like Weirton, West Virginia, steel plant went away. Now they're making batteries next generation. Yeah. That's a transformation story, and I think everyone is unambiguously on board with turning on a plant. I think there's a second conversation with the workforce, and that's around the places where they know they are showing up to work at a factory in a supply chain that is shifting. And they want the industry and that firm to invest in a way that creates certainty for the long run. Yeah. So if they're seeing, like, for example, Cummins has made a pivot in some of its factories to go from hydrocarbon to an electrolyzer manufacturing supply chain, they, I think, appreciate and lean into that because they know that's where the global economy is going. They want to be part of a supply chain that's not going to run out of runway in a few years. They'd rather be part of a longer run. And then there's, we talk about the energy workforce, I think, in a narrow way. There's a much broader part of it, which is the workers at the construction sites who aren't breathing in diesel, the SEIU workers who appreciate the improvements to the HVAC system because they have better working conditions, the food and commercial workers who appreciate some of the measures we're taking. So I think there's that part of it. And then there's the really macro, which is there are a whole lot of young people who now see themselves in the building trades and in blue-collar jobs that didn't before, and that's also really exciting for the country and for those institutions.
That's really because of the Climate Corps, or just because of the importance of electrification?
Because of a Climate Corps that we've launched that now has 15,000 boots on the ground, and by the end of the year we'll have 20,000. And because of a sense that when you sign up for these jobs, you're signing up for not just a paycheck, but being part of a national mission.
My a colleague at HeatMap, Matt Zeitlin, talks about the electrician threshold, which is that if you are working in climate, you should be asking yourself every day, would it be more important, like whatever I'm doing in climate, should I in fact just be an electrician? Like whatever I'm doing during my day in climate, would it be more impactful, a word I don't like, but I can't think of another word right now, would it be more impactful for me to just become an electrician? And his real take here is that many folks should really be asking themselves this question because we need more electricians and maybe fewer other roles. However, it's an important question.
I met with a tech CEO who said the number one workforce need that we had in the United States was to recruit 500,000 more electricians. Not
and
more
why was
coders. Because at the end of the day, the tech industry is converting electrons into numbers.
Yeah.
And we need more people putting electrons into the system that can turn into numbers that we can harness for economic growth. And so to me, that was an eye-opening thing to hear. That's really, it really is. It is the national calling right now, is the building trades that are going to put the pipes in, the wires up, the electric generation into the system.
So I want to give people a kind of roadmap. Okay, I want to talk about AI. We've kind of hinted at this going so far. We want to talk about trade, permitting reform, just like topics I want to hit before we go to the audience for questions, which isn't anywhere close. I just want to, so let's talk about trade. What are we missing in the trade regime? There's a bipartisan bill in the Senate right now. There's a couple different versions of it that would impose some kind of carbon border adjustment on U.S. exports and U.S. imports. Is that the approach that we should be thinking about taking? How does the Biden administration feel about that approach? And more broadly, is that the path we should begin to be walking down on trade?
Top line answer, which you wouldn't expect from me, yes. We are working really hard on laying the data foundation. That's been the subject of a lot of legislation. We welcome that legislation. Chris Coons, one of the sponsors of it, a Yale alum. But we're working really hard to advance the ball there. And just the last couple of weeks, I announced progress that we're making towards a uniform, comprehensive U.S. government approach to measuring carbon intensity. But on top of that, we got to do something with the data. And the do something is to put it in conversation with the marketplace, to put it in conversation with the economic incentives that firms have, and to put it in conversation with where our trading partners are going. The European CBAM goes into effect January 1, 2026 in terms of the economics of the CBAM. We have to race to I think, meet our trade partners and build a harmonized system around the world. I think the work Senator Whitehouse and others have done to put the ideas into the arena are not just a great starting point, but actually quite well developed, as you mentioned, in a bipartisan way. And we shouldn't waste time getting that done. The critical piece of that will be, how do you do it in a way that both bends the global emissions trajectory in the industrial sector and lifts up workers, especially those who I think are appropriately focused on making sure that there's a recognition in the nuance between primary steel, secondary steel, the various technologies that go into making this. We've got to be thoughtful about it so that we're lifting up workers in the process.
How will a carbon border adjustment work? You cited the Europe example, and in Europe, in 2026, they're going to put a carbon border adjustment on imports based on the European carbon price that already exists. But of course, the US does not have a carbon price. And so how would a US system work given that we do not have a domestic price on carbon? And unless you want to make some amazing news about a month before the election, do not anticipate having one anytime soon.
Yeah, look, that's going to be the hard work of the
Yeah.
legislative process. I will say the U.S. has an inbuilt advantage. Steel, aluminum, other things being produced half as dirty as everywhere else. I think we've leaned in $7 billion to the Inflation Reduction Act to push out technologies like DRI that are going to be critical to building on that advantage. And I do think there are some prices that operate in this space, and I won't elaborate on that. So I don't think we are without some prices that operate in this space and very specific per unit monetary incentives that also operate in this space. And I think as
What's an
Congress
example,
shapes...
if you can give, like, what's an example of that?
So, for example, the tax credit for carbon capture sequestration operates in this space. For example, some of the emission standards that travel together with GHG operate in the space. So I think when you account for all of that, there may be more scaffolding that needs to be built on top of it. But there's definitely a lot there for Congress to do its important work, which I hope they will do quickly and in a bipartisan way.
When you are doing climate policy in the White House or thinking about climate policy, considering it, how much do you think about global emissions versus domestic emissions? Because one of the interesting facts of our climate policy system is that the U.S. is really only, has to report, is responsible for, in a Paris Agreement context, its domestic emissions. But of course, all the actions that we take as the world's as the world's largest economy and second largest greenhouse gas emitter have an effect on the global emissions profile. So how do you go about thinking about this problem?
Yeah, I mean, my job definitionally is focused on domestic action. But I think strong domestic action is the necessary predicate for leadership overseas.
Yeah.
And a few of the ways that we think about how that translates, one is how are we building diffusion from a technology perspective and call it innovation and cost of capital and deployment that very easily translates overseas. There's been analysis on the hard tech side that the IRA helps reduce the hard tech costs 10, 15, 20% in key tech that will help with deployment overseas. But it's also, when you're teaching U.S. capital markets to finance something, that's actually very helpful to deployment overseas. The second is how you're building some of the policy platforms that can get replicated around the world. We've seen that in methane, in hydrofluorocarbons. We've seen it with the EV transformation that's taking place. And then the other piece that's so important is how do you build the global momentum behind it? And that's the translating the domestic action into global leadership piece of it.
How does I think one, it's funny, you sometimes see folks talk about how the various U.S. tariffs on foreign-made or Chinese-made EVs, Chinese-made solar panels kind of play into this. I wonder how you think about it in this context, because how do you think about the importance, or why do we hit tariffs on these, imports, given that we're looking to reduce our own emissions here in the U.S. and EVs, I can kind of understand. I mean, EVs, I think, are a tougher case. It's funny, I was listening to an interview between Ezra Klein and Jason Furman, and Ezra asked Jason Furman, the Harvard economist, about EVs. Should we be putting tariffs on EVs? And he replied about solar panels, which are a much more commodity product. So I want to ask you the solar panel version of the question, because it's harder in some ways. Why do we have tariffs on solar panels, and does it ultimately serve U.S. decarbonization goals?
I think not only does it serve U.S. decarbonization goals, I think it improves the world's ability to hit our decarbonization targets. Here's why. You look at semiconductors, a concentrated supply chain and a brittle supply chain. 3 summers ago, because of that concentration in the Chinese supply chain, U.S. firms were idling. Auto factories were idling here in the United States. Now, let me rewind to this is the decisive decade for climate action. If we are stuck with a concentrated and brittle supply chain in one of the essential technologies to meet our marks in the decisive decade, we have a big problem. So launching a race to the top around the world to build out more factory floor, a more diverse, and then by extension, more resilient supply chain in a technology like solar, I think is really important. The second is a lot of solar innovation, battery innovation, other things have happened in our universities and in our labs. We've lacked the factory floor to rapidly commercialize that. I was in Dalton, Georgia. I walked across the parking lot from Factory 1 to Factory 2, and they had made a 30% efficiency gain just in that period of time by bringing the factory floor closer to where the innovation is taking
Between
place.
when the factories were built, basically?
Yeah. A matter of a year. I think we actually accelerate the pace with which we're coming down technology cost curves, and I think that's a really important thing. And the last piece is in some ways the first piece. And, if we're building a clean energy economy around the world, it has to abide by human rights standards. It has to be built in a way that is clean and sustainable. Our solar panels have half the embodied carbon, and they don't have the human rights violations. And that's incredibly important because we're trying to build a world that we want to live in, and we can be smart from the start in the clean energy economy.
On nuclear, there was recently the news that 3 Mile Island is going to be reopened and renamed and serve AI. And I wonder, when you talk to utilities and you talk to energy providers about AI and just the rise in power demand, what are you hearing, first of all? And second of all, do you think we're going to need more new nuclear reactors in the U.S. to meet the rise in electricity demand from AI and manufacturing and EVs and everything else we're trying to do with the grid?
I'll tell you what I am hearing and what I wish I were hearing. What I am hearing is there's a lot of load that's showing up. It's load that I did not plan for in my last IRP, and it's thrown me off my game. I was committed to net zero by date X, and now I'm feeling a little wishy-washy about where I'm going. That's what I'm hearing, and I say this not to be denigrating. I say this just to be on the level. What I wish I were hearing is this is an incredible opportunity for me to accelerate the pace of my decarbonization goals. I have political economy at my back. Everyone wants, including the U.S. government led by President Biden, Vice President Harris, everyone wants me to be successful at providing power to ensure that the U.S. dominates AI going forward. Everyone wants me to succeed at delivering clean energy at scale and speed. And so what I'm doing is aggregating my demand for things like transformers and switch gears and circuit breakers, the parts, the literal widgets that are rate governors on my ability to race ahead, and making sure that we get more of those into the market. I'm taking advantage of every run fast opportunity I have on transmission, from reconductoring to leveraging existing interconnection. And I'm making sure that I'm squeezing more juice out of either plants past, plants future. I don't think we're there yet. But I do think there are smart folks in the utility sector and smart folks in the tech sector who are coming together. And it's not just 3 Mile Island, it's Talon and Amazon, it's Google working on a new tariff with Duke, it's APS leaning into the opportunity, it's folks in Western Michigan bringing back the Palisades plant where I visited recently. So I think the bones are there. We just got to put it all together by Halloween.
And why aren't you hearing that from utilities?
It is a slow, and I say this with due respect, a slow and steady wins the race, stable sector. It's why investors like the utility sector, a regulated sector where they don't love to have a brand new conversation they've never had with their PUC for the first time. It's not just about the innovation and inventiveness in the boardroom, it's all of their stakeholders. And they're doing it at a time when we've asked them to upgrade the grid, we've asked them to up their ambition on clean energy. So it's a new log on the fire, and it's hard. But hopefully their message they're hearing from the Biden administration is, we want to be your partner. We are willing to go with you to Congress or wherever to get you even more tools. But let's not use this as an opportunity to lower our sights. Let's actually use this as an opportunity to level up our ambition. And I think in a lot of cases, we're breaking through.
In terms of those tools, what tools do utilities tell you that they need in Congress?
One of them is the supply chain piece.
Yeah.
Really.
This is on transformers.
Yeah, and I
anything,
truly, I think this is an underweighted part of the energy conversation. We need more investment, more capital formation in that part of the supply chain, period, full stop.
And why hasn't it happened? Because I've heard Biden administration officials say this for 18 months, and I think it's still staggering along. There was this moment last week where Hurricane Helene looked like it might have wrecked some huge number, more than 100 substations in western North Carolina. Now it seems the number's a lot smaller, but had that happened, it would have been this total disaster to replace. So why has it not happened yet?
You have a very small number of firms that have the technical expertise to make this stuff. They enjoy a really favorable market position, but they also carry with them the scars from previous boom and bust cycles in the power game. And they are worried about what the floor looks like, and that's what they're focused on rather than what the ceiling may open up. And so that's where the tax credits have helped. But one of the things, we went to Congress and asked for more resources in the Defense Production Act to help accelerate grid investment. That might be worth a conversation worth having again.
Do you think are utilities telling you they need permitting reform? Are merchant developers telling you they need permitting reform?
So grid components, de-risking some of the newer technology. So I think there are some utilities who are closer to SMR and other deployment and want a little bit more support, and we're trying to figure out how we can do it. And permitting reform is a piece of it. And I think on permitting reform, it's not just citing of stuff. Really, it's a big conversation about cost allocation, who's paying for the system upgrades. And in certain cases, they're working it out through creative bilateral tariffs. I think that's how we probably solve for the 25, 50, or 75 gigs of AI demand that's coming. But I think that's a bigger conversation that's overdue, and we've been chipping away at it. But there's a sea change that probably needs to happen.
On permitting reform, let's look at that more closely. So there's kind of, I think when you talk to folks, if Congress were to do any kind of permitting reform, it would be in the lame duck after the election. We're now close enough to the election, we can say that with some confidence. Should it happen during that time? And do you think, can it happen during that time? Is the Biden administration pushing for it?
It's, Senator Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Speaker Johnson are far more adept at figuring out what they can schedule when. So I won't say lame duck, but I'll say very soon, months this year or months next year is the time frame in which I think the country should move forward. Progress, not just, by the way, on permitting in the energy domain.
Yeah.
There's a bipartisan bill on YIMBY in housing, and you've written about this eloquently, but I think it's worth restating for everybody. If you can't build housing where people live, then you're going to build housing where people don't live. Then you're going to build a big road, and then you're going to put a bunch of cars on it and then complain about the transportation sector pollution. Housing permitting reform is climate permitting reform.
And it's been interesting. I mean, Harris has really picked up on this point too, even since I wrote a piece saying, as you're saying, writing about this in August, and even since then, or July, I feel like this has become a big theme of the campaign, which I realize you can't talk about. However, this is something that I feel like Democrats are
It's
paying more
a
attention
huge
to.
deal. And Brian Schatz has bipartisan Senate legislation in this space. Then look at broadband. We've got Ben Ray Lujan and Barrasso and others who've introduced bipartisan legislation to get broadband out. no one's slowing down in the information age for us to permit and get high-speed internet out to rural areas. But by leaving that issue unresolved, we're keeping off the table a bunch of climate-smart agriculture solutions that should be accessible to everybody. So that's climate permitting. And then, of course, energy. But, I think all of this should reflect what I think is an emerging environmental consensus, which is a consensus that's gone from slowing things down to speeding things up, shutting things down to building the solutions that we need. That's the emerging environmental consensus. Congress should act broadly to reflect that consensus into the law.
Do you think that is an emerging, I guess my question, I want to push back against this a little bit, because it seems like on the one hand you hear about an emerging consensus that we need to build more and more from Democrats, from folks in the clean energy industry, from folks who pay attention to housing issues. On the other hand, I think the other thing you see, and you see it a little bit on permitting reform, is that there's a bit of a conflict emerging between the clean energy industry and folks who want to build up the clean energy industry and some of the classic environmental groups. And one place where this conflict is creating real friction is in the Manchin-Barrasso. So Senator Manchin and Senator Barrasso have proposed a not technically bipartisan, because Senator Manchin is no longer a Democrat. However, he caucuses with the Democrats, so we're going to call it bipartisan, have proposed a bipartisan-ish version of the permitting reform bill that trades a lot of clarity around how to build new long-distance transmission and transmission broadly, how to pay for transmission, all these questions that have really hampered the transmission construction in the U.S., which has in turn hampered renewable construction, for some loosening of trading liquefied natural gas.
And mandatory lease sales of oil and gas and other
kind of following up, because the IRA already mandated some of this, and now it's going to really, really mandate kind of the most important tracts get sold. I mean, let's actually just drill down on that. How are you feeling about that proposal? Would you take that compromise?
Look, I think that's not a conversation I'll have on this stage.
That's fair.
But it gives me pause and is a source of some anxiety that, number one, the conversation in Congress right now makes it seem like transmission is a Democratic policy priority when it boosts reliability and lowers rates. I thought Republicans and Democrats both agreed we need to boost reliability and lower rates. So I don't know why that needs to be offset by any measure. That's thing number one. Thing number two is...
This is the challenge of talking about things.
Yeah.
Is that if Democrats say, oh, we really value this, then suddenly it's a Democratic priority.
And then the second is, I think there is how do we accelerate the siting and permitting of things. And then there is how do we shift more power to the oil and gas industry. The conversation around leasing happening against a backdrop where the industry itself is moving away from long cycle investment to short cycle investment. It's tough.
Yeah.
So I would hope that more of the permitting conversation were a permitting conversation.
Well, one way this sometimes gets reflected is that you'll hear environmentalists say, any policy that makes the oil and gas industry happy or bigger, we should not take. And that makes making a comment.
And I reject that.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, if ExxonMobil wants to pay for a pipeline that will help us deliver what was once solar and wind as a fuel to help us decarbonize a steel plant, they can be for it and I can be for it. If there is Blackstone, for example, has a project, Tallgrass, that has converted a pipeline that used to pull hydrocarbons out of the ground. It's now flipped the pipeline around and is putting CO2 into the ground. They can be for that. I can be for that. Not speaking to the specific project, but conceptually. So I don't think it's not the actor. It's the question of whether this is directionally consistent with trying to chase down a 1.5 degree future or not. We are behind as a world, and we need to run faster in that direction. If it's not directionally consistent, that's a problem.
What do you hear from environmental groups on this? Do they reflect? Do they agree? Do they feel like what is the counter? What's the other narrative they have in their head, or what's the kind of narrative that folks compare to? Because I hear that it's interesting that you reject that. One argument I hear from a number of environmental groups is that we should kind of reject anything that's going to expand the fossil fuel industry because we need to say no to any fossil investment to reach the 1.5C goal. And so they'd rather kind of freeze things in place and fight out every transmission fight than take this broad deal to expand industrial infrastructure across the country in its various forms.
I think neither the environmental NGO sector nor the fossil sector are monolithic. And I think there are folks who are trying to find ways forward at the intersection on the Venn diagram. And that's, if they're coming to smart solutions, that's where I'd like to be spending my time and energy. But I'll say one thing that's somewhat off topic, but somewhat on topic. You know, when you've got the petroleum manufacturers paying for basically all of the ads to slow down the deployment of electric vehicles, you can understand where some of the environmental NGOs are coming from.
We are going to go to questions now pretty soon. So just after this, please start thinking of your questions. As a reminder, a question is an interrogative that ends in a question mark. Thinking back, you know, it's been almost 4 years for the Biden administration. What has been harder than you thought it would be going in?
The power sector has been harder than I thought it would be going in. And it's because we were met with a number of supply chain challenges along the way. The sorting out of the economics of grid build-out has been harder and more politically challenging. As I noted earlier, it's become a weird democratic passion and not something that we can all agree on, which is historically been true. We've been able to come together on the vigor of the grid. And then I think, look, the load growth, we're the dog that caught the car on American manufacturing. We've brought it back. It's not just AI. We brought back American manufacturing. That's creating a ton of load. And that's making that sort of policy baseline very complicated. So that's been harder, but I think it's good hard work.
What's been easier? Anything. Maybe nothing's been easier.
You know, I've been very surprised at the uptake in the agricultural sector around climate smart agriculture solutions. We're at 80,000 farms, 75 million acres in the United States implementing climate smart agriculture practices. The ag lobby is now fighting for what House Republicans would call climate provisions. That's a massive transformation in 3.5 years. That's not where we were. And when you look at the next farm bill, all of a sudden it looks like an opportunity to scale up this new source of revenue for farmers and ranchers, like the 80,000 who've already signed up for climate smart ag. And that change in the economics and the political economy in the ag sector makes me very hopeful about the overall enterprise.
Fascinating. I want to dig into the power sector more, but let's go to questions because I feel like they're going to get better questions from the audience. People always know more than you do. Let's go here in the front, Reg, and there's going to be a microphone runner coming down. So let's do it like this. I'll call on you, especially if I can see your name tag, and then someone will come down with a microphone and you can ask the question once they're here.
Thank you for your time. Okay,
Thank
great. Question I have is pertaining to green hydrogen as a alternative fuel source How is it that so many governments, international governments, our local government are investing so much money into producing green hydrogen and touting it as an alternative fuel source, but there's still so much development that needs to occur, finding ways to efficiently transport and use the green hydrogen, but there are still governments and companies that are investing, 10, $20 billion into green hydrogen with the hope that there's going to be the technology there to adequately transport and use it. How do they justify spending that amount of capital with still so much further development needed?
So first, let me say sort of the policy that's coming. The Treasury Department, in heroic work in this administration, has finalized 75 guidance projects, different parts of the tax code that are now updated to reflect our best thinking on how to move the economy forward on clean energy in particular. One of the guidance projects that will be finalized before the end of the year is the 45V tax credit, the hydrogen tax credit. And one of the things we've been wrestling with to make sure that what is final is good is to focus all of the best science into the attributes of what is being produced and rewarded. So thing number one, and I know you're talking about midstream, but let me just talk about upstream for a second. It's really important that we stick to this concept of additionality and integrity around the production of green hydrogen if we're going to reward it at the highest level in the tax credit. And the departments spend a lot of time working with those questions, both internally with the Department of Energy and the EPA. But I think that upstream needs to be resolved well here in the United States and around the world. That's thing number one. Thing number two is on the downstream side and sort of the demand side, and I think part of the reason why you're seeing folks put tens of billions of dollars up is because when you look downstream and on the demand side, there are some parts of the industrial sector in particular and in heavy-duty transportation that are just really hard to pivot, especially in the short term, with any other technology approach. Now, I know folks have been racing with, for example, industrial-grade heat pumps and other ways to electrify the industrial sector. Same can be said about really heavy applications in the transportation sector. But I like the hedge of having hydrogen play in that space as long as we have good environmental assurance around it. So I think they see, as I do, a really strong demand case for it. On the midstream, I think this is why you're seeing a lot of the hydrogen build-out take place in a hub fashion in the United States. Now, obviously, we had an infrastructure law that facilitates that with a multi-billion-dollar investment, but I think you're going to see that early adoption take place where the generation of the hydrogen and the use of the hydrogen are relatively co-located. That midstream infrastructure, which frankly I think midstream infrastructure more broadly in heavier industries has been slow to build out. That will take a little bit more time. I don't think it's as technologically exotic as you suggested. I think it's hard, it's complex. There are corrosion issues, other things. But I think we can get our head wrapped around it to harness the opportunity for the hardest to decarbonize.
It seems like this is a common issue across industrial decarbonization. Let's get the mic to Odette in the front, and I'm going to ask a follow-up question. It seems like this is a common issue across industrial decarbonization where lining up supply and demand is really tricky. Like it exists in hydrogen, but it exists in CDR too. It exists in green steel. The CEO of Cleveland Cliffs recently kind of raised some questions about whether he was going to take I think a $500 million grant from the U.S. government to help modernize and decarbonize his facility, and he ultimately walked that back. But should the government be doing more to guarantee demand for things like carbon removal, things like hydrogen, things like green steel? It's already subsidizing those products, but those subsidies are dependent on finding a buyer. Should the government also step in and be like, well, until we fully line up supply and demand here, we're going to be the buyer of first resort as it is?
Advanced market contracts are absolutely critical in some of these heavy capex, high market risk investments. We talk about sustainable aviation kind of taking off during the Biden administration. Rewind to the Obama administration, about halfway through, he actually used the Defense Production Act and made the Air Force the first buyer of some of the sustainable aviation to take away that market risk, which is really such a barrier in these capex intensive arenas. I think, I love our climate policy office at the White House, so let me plug that. I think it's been an incredible investment by the president. We have senior directors for every sector of the economy. One of our former senior directors for the industrial sector is actually trying to build out this AMC in the direct air capture market, the CDR market. And our current senior director actually got the folks together in the auto arena to see if they will commit on a forward basis to buying clean steel. They're the largest primary steel purchasers in the United States. So I think that's essential work. I think we've done some of that, but we're going to have to keep scaling it up if we're going to pull these technologies forward.
Hi, so my question is, let's just say in a perfect world, you can build more factories in the US. Would you consider potentially making factory towns, like back in the 20s and 50s? Around the factories, there would be houses, maybe a little grocery store. Do you think that that's something that could help with the housing market, potentially help people, maybe push for more factories, maybe more supplies? Do you think you could incorporate factory towns in order to build more factories?
That's such an interesting question, and I want to take some of that back and just think about it. Part of the way we've gone about at least some of the intuition behind your question, I think, is by going to the places where the factory was ripped out. So when the factory went away, some folks moved out, but some folks are still there. A lot of the housing stock is still there. Some of that water infrastructure is there. The utilities still there. And so our focus on reinvesting in those communities is, I think, essential for a bunch of moral reasons, but there's also essential from a convenience perspective. These are our plug-and-play opportunities. So I think we've been trying to do that. I think about this timber town that I visited up in northern Maine, where they had lost their timber facility. Now they're making high-efficiency insulation. The housing's still there. The workers still there. The school is literally across the street. So they're able to take advantage of that existing infrastructure. I think we should do that, absolutely essential. What you're also seeing is some of these regional plays develop as we build out our clean energy economy, potentially a lithium triangle in California, in Arizona, and Nevada, facilitating not just getting the lithium out of the ground, but also building a circular economy to ensure our mineral security going forward, a battery belt in the southeast, solar hubs developing around the country. So I'm excited about some of this stuff coming together because those are engines for innovation and economies of scale as well.
Let's go. In the front, in the middle here. Let's go in the middle. A khaki blue blazer, black glasses. That actually, yes, that's here, but also there.
I get to make a Yale joke about blue blazer khakis. Is not
well done. Yes,
discerning.
yes, yeah, no.
Rob, Ali, thanks so much. Super interesting discussion. I have a question about messaging and messengers as relates to this load growth piece, which is that, you mentioned that load growth is a tremendous challenge as well as a tremendous opportunity. One of the big issues that we're seeing is proposal of substantial new gas investment. And I guess it's really calling into question both affordability and reliability. Now, gas has conventionally been seen as both affordable and reliable. I think there have been a lot more studies showing that actually one of the biggest drivers of electricity bill increases is gas volatility. And what we've seen during Winter Storms Uri and Elliott, underperformance in gas has really been a big issue. At the same time, those that are most concerned about it are climate and environmental groups, which don't necessarily have credibility in the states where we're seeing this gas buildup. So, simple question is, do we have the right messengers for the next 3 to 5 years to successfully navigate this issue? And how can we pull together the right messengers and messaging to be able to tackle this issue head on?
Look, getting the facts in the hands of the right people is so important. And I want to double click for those of you who don't have the benefit. Actually, a former colleague of mine worked on an analysis by Energy Innovation that lays out some of the drivers of the rates that we're seeing across the country, and it's inefficient investment in fossil or inefficient retention of certain fossil is a big part of it. I think at a time when we are focused rightfully on reducing rates for consumers, aggressively, vigorously reducing rates for customers, we need to make sure public utility commissions and the stakeholders around public utility commissions, folks who are looking out for the ratepayer, understand what the implications are from a cost perspective. I think the second piece, and I'll sound like a little bit of a broken record because this may seem like my answer to everything, is to go to the people who stand to gain the economic upside of building the alternative. How do we make sure that when a utility chooses to make the solar or storage facility or chooses to invest in the nuclear, that's translating into good-paying, middle-class supporting jobs? And who are those people? And will they be part of advocating for the solution? I think that's an essential part of all of this. So, I think we get the information in front of the sort of scorekeepers from a rate perspective, and then we get the upside opportunity in the hands of the people who stand to gain economically. If we do that work, I think we will meet the demand. We will dominate the AI revolution. We will manufacture here in the United States like we've never done before, and we'll do it all while delivering clean electrons onto the grid.
One more last question here in the front. Blue sweater, teal sweater.
Awesome. My question is also related to messaging a bit. I'm curious if you can speak to how the narrative has changed from green and climate and clean sources of energy to national security, defense, resiliency. Are you seeing that in specific sectors, specific industries? And how are you thinking about that kind of come a potentially new administration?
Yeah. Our former climate comms person is in the room and now stolen by Yale University. So I almost want to punt it to her. But look, I think the suite of climate solutions that we have accrue to so many bottom lines. And it's really important for us to be prepared to be making the case on all of them all of the time. I think about the Inflation Reduction Act, which you may recall was called Build Back Better, that spoke to, at once, spoke to our ability to come out of an economic crisis that was a short-term economic crisis, spoke to our ability to bring back manufacturing after decades of disinvestment, spoke to our ability to rectify supply chain vulnerabilities, spoke to our ability to respond to the energy shocks coming out of Russia's aggression in the Ukraine, spoke to public health that, you'll remember we were as sensitive as we've ever been about what goes into our lungs after the COVID pandemic. We might not remember that, but we were, spoke to that sensitivity on public health. And we kept doing all of that throughout. And that's why I think even in the ups and downs of the political cycles in Washington, we were able to make inch by inch progress until the last day, and we got the deal done. there's not one silver bullet solution to climate change, and there's not one silver bullet message to build the politics around the solutions. And maybe this goes to the messenger's point. Not only do you need all of those messages told, and they're factual, they're grounded in reality, you also need the breadth of the coalition telling that message. If you got Green Bean over here talking about job creation, that's not going to be as successful as Hard Hat talking about job creation. If you got someone wearing a white coat or scrubs talking about the public health, they're going to be far more eloquent at it than some Wall Street trader. But everybody's got to be telling their part of the story. Everyone's got to see themselves in this crisis and also see themselves in the opportunity.
Ali Zaidi, I think we're going to have to leave it there. But Ali Zaidi, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.